So we visited an 11-year-old's gravesite.
Your age.
I don't want to die.
We didn't do it on purpose, but we went to the Merida main cemetery, also known as the Cementerio General. And if you ever go to, especially a larger cemetery, you're going to inevitably start looking at the names and the dates and the details of a cemetery, and you're gonna find something that pulls at your heart. So yesterday, one of those moments was finding the gravesite of an 11-year-old, and 11 in particular because, of course, Alex is 11. I think letting your children participate in memorial services or the funeral or the burial, like all those things, I think is really important for your child. But you don't have to wait for a loved one to pass away in order to have these memories with your child. I think death is something that children start to understand pretty early in life, and they tend to have lots of questions. So creating opportunities to discuss, and creating opportunities not just to discuss life and death topics, but also to visualize a little bit of it, I think can be very helpful to your child, especially because how many people do you know that loses a loved one and they feel this sense of aloneness? And it's usually because, of course, a death of a loved one is so very personal and you can't help but kind of have that feeling. But when you've got experiences with other death, with observing grave sites and observing the way the living celebrate and honor their loved ones who have passed, it makes that hurt sometimes a little bit less. We went to the Merida Cemetery, the Merida Main Cemetery, which was established in 1821. This is now 2021. So in November of this year, near Dia de los Muertos, they will be celebrating their 200th anniversary. As with any major city, Merida used to be much, much smaller, and essentially the centro area or the downtown area used to be the gist, right, the heart of the city. And back before 1821, people buried their loved ones near their churches, of which Merida has plenty, and it was decided that that was not okay. It was not okay for this small city to have so many grave sites. And so the Cementerio General was created, and at the time it was located outside of Merida so that there would be less graveyards within Merida proper. Now, of course, today Merida has grown, and I would even consider it pretty much in Centro because it wasn't too far. But nonetheless, that's interesting history. Of course, here in Merida, Mexico, I don't have any loved ones that have passed, but as you walk through the grave sites, you'll get to observe the families that are buried together. And now you'll see a lot of husband and wives, and unfortunately, you'll even see a lot of parents with their children. And so this was one such example where we saw the father and the child buried, and the child, once we looked at the dates, turned out to be 11 years old when they passed. And so when you celebrate, when you go to the grave sites of loved ones or other people's loved ones, conversation can come up. And then you get to talk about your relatives. Alex has only been to one funeral service, which was for my mother, and so he knows where her ashes are, as well as we visited the cemeteries of his great-grandfathers, both of which who had military service. These are the things that we noticed, which were very different from the cemeteries we visited in the US together. The grave sites themselves don't exactly look like the grave sites of the US. They do look like, I guess, the more ornate ones that you might find, but they don't have gravestones proper, right? They have instead houses on top of their graves. I say again, houses, little houses. And a lot of these houses have windows or doors. Some of them are open, some of them are closed. Inside, you can find pictures and candles and flowers. You can even find food. And because Merida in particular is a very hot location, we also have hurricanes and such. There's a lot of wear and tear that happen. And having been to Hanal Pashan last year, we were able to observe the similarities between Hanal Pashan and these cemeteries. Hanal Pashan, by the way, is the Mayan Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, where they celebrate and invite their lost family members to come home for the day or the evening. So Hanal Pashan, very similar concept where in your homes you would create this temporary altar on which would be pictures and candles, especially, and the candles and flowers were super important because of the scent. Mayans believed, and it's scientifically proven, that the sense of smell is the strongest sense that we have. It is the one most likely to trigger your memories of the past or even just information. So it's a very powerful sense. And so the Mayans really honor this ability that we as humans have. The purpose of the candles and the flowers and the food, especially the cooked food, is to bring the sense of smell into the world so that your loved ones who are roaming the world can then know where home is. They can smell those familiar smells and they can come and find their home, both in your physical home during Hanal Pashan as well as their home in the cemetery. And it's, again, a literal house that they're coming back to. And so the homes at the grave sites, not only are they homes that have some of those memories, but the homes themselves are a miniature reflection of the homes that the loved ones have once lived in. There really were just so many things to observe at the cemetery. Another thing, there are people that are buried underground in the cemetery, right? And apparently at each location you have essentially one person buried. However, when the next person unfortunately passes away, and this could be years after, of course, what can sometimes happen is that the remains of the original person who was buried in that location might be dug up again and put into what they call an osario box. And it's really a box where the bones and ashes of your loved ones would be placed in. And then the most recent person who passed away would be buried in that same location, okay? And so the osario box that held whoever had passed previously, behind these houses, a lot of times there were these openings in which the osario boxes are placed. So sometimes there would be only one box and sometimes there would be multiple boxes, just to represent, again, that history and this idea that was mentioned during Hanal Pashan, which is they don't like the idea of lost souls who have nowhere to go to, right? Sometimes we are the last of our line, or perhaps we pass in a location where our family isn't located. And so during Hanal Pashan, there's extra provided. There's extra food and extra things provided in memory of the people who have passed who don't necessarily have a home. So I want you to imagine, and again, as a Christian, we don't really believe that people are roaming the earth necessarily, but just as a concept, imagine that during Hanal Pashan and even in these cemeteries, you are welcoming not only your loved ones who have passed, but also strangers. The Mayan and the Mexican sense of hospitality extends not only to the foreigners that visit, but also to the lost souls that happen to be in the area. And so while it's probably most common that boxes who are stacked next to each other are in fact related, there is a probability, in fact, that one or more of those boxes are actually not related, and there's simply somebody who happened to pass away that didn't necessarily have a home, a gravestone, a graveyard of their own to go to, and so a neighbor was willing to extend their home. It's a really beautiful concept, and I only read this part in one random blog, so I have no idea how accurate or how popular the concept or belief is. But I feel like in the US, I've always been told this story of how sad it is that some grave sites are not maintained, right? There's nobody that comes by to kind of get rid of the weeds or place new flowers, and so there was this sense of sadness. It is in fact one of the many reasons why when I pass, I actually don't want to be buried. I want to be cremated, and I love the idea of my ashes being nowhere in particular. Throw me uncontained in the ocean or something, simply because I don't like the idea of a grave site, a location for myself. And I don't like the idea of, for example, my son feeling this heaviness at having to maintain my grave site for the rest of his life. That to me is a very sad concept. I would rather my son, of course he's going to mourn when I first pass, but ultimately I want my son to go, okay, I had X number of years with this amazing woman, and while it hurts, she has equipped me with the ability to move on and appreciate the rest of my life, and I don't have to dwell on the loss of my amazing mother, just saying. But I read, again, I don't know how popular this idea is, that when you see a gravesite that is well maintained, right? It's got fresh flowers, somebody has, bleached and scrubbed the gravestones to make it look pretty and new and well taken care of, that it's a sign that the family left behind is still a little bit in mourning, that they are still feeling a sadness and a sense of duty to taking care of this gravesite, which is completely natural and nothing to be ashamed of or upset about. However, when you see a gravesite that's not taken care of, where nobody has come by to leave fresh flowers, where they've allowed the weeds and nature to kind of crawl all over it, the wear and tear is such that it's actually broken in some way, that it's not a sad thing. It is a positive sign of a family that was able to kind of transition through that mourning phase and is now able to live life without having to come back, to physically come back to the gravesite to remember or to maintain. And because Mexico in particular has Hanal Pishan, where they celebrate not the loss of the loved ones, but the life of the loved ones, then there's this positive remembrance. Losing a loved one, again, it's definitely sad all over the world, to include Mexico. But at the end of the day, what they focus on is the life. They focus on the fact that they lived, and they celebrate that life and all the eccentric details that every life tends to have. So it's much less about grieving, it's much less about loss, but more that celebration, the appreciation of what that person was for you. So I just found that beautiful, and especially because I had read that blog right before coming to the cemetery. As I saw many grave sites that were not kept up, I thought to myself, it's because their children are happy, because their kids have celebrated and appreciated and taken all they could from the love of the person they once buried. Ooh, and the last thing that I found really interesting, if I'm going to liken the grave sites, the majority of the grave sites at the Merida Cemetery as houses, these would be almost apartments. These are very small mausoleums that are stacked one on top of each other, almost like a hole in the wall. And while it seemed like the majority are by one of the entrances, I actually found many smaller ones throughout the cemetery along its outer walls. So it was a really interesting place to go. And unless there is a gated cemetery, especially gated mausoleums where there's no physical access to that, like, you shouldn't be jumping over gates. That's what I'm saying. Generally speaking though, most cemeteries absolutely allow you to not only walk the main pathways, but to get in there, to get into those individual grave sites so you can see the names, the dates, the places. Oh, last thing that I thought was super interesting was most of these grave sites only had one date, which I believe is the date that the loved one had passed. Only very few had the birth date on there. And the ones we noticed that had the birth dates were all children. So I don't know necessarily the ages of most of the people buried at the Merida Cemetery because they don't have a birth date. However, if they were a child, that stood out much, much more. So you could see which grave sites were honoring children as opposed to adults. Dia de los Muertos, for example, there it's actually celebrated on 2 days, November 1st and 2nd, where the first is to honor children who have passed, and the second is to honor the adults. And you can see that even in the grave sites, it's visually much easier to see whether a gravesite is for a child or if it is for somebody who has lived at least until adulthood. And so if you want to visit the Merida Cemetery in particular, they are open every day except for some holidays from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. I'm hearing that they close those doors very promptly, so you don't want to be arriving too late. And every Wednesday at 8 p.m. they are doing a nighttime tour of the cemetery where you'll have a night guard who tells you some of the fascinating stories and histories. Now, I am told that that is done in Spanish, and so I have not gone, although I think it would be great to find a translator who could help me understand a little bit more of what's being spoken as we traverse through.